Hello students, in this mini lecture we're going to be talking about muscle metabolism. In this case I'm talking about how does the muscle get energy to do its work. Because when a muscle contracts, as we learned earlier, when a muscle contracts it needs intracellular energy to do that. And it uses a molecule called ATP. And ATP is a molecule with high energy bonds. And when ATP breaks down into ADP, that releases energy. And that allows the myosin head, that cocks the myosin head back, and the myosin head can bind to actin and pull. So our question is, where does that ATP come from? So the muscle, in order for the muscle to contract, it needs to use ATP. Where does the ATP come from? There are three ways that we can generate ATP in the muscle. One of them is through something called direct phosphorylation, where we use something called creatine phosphate. And we link creatine phosphate. It's a protein. We link that with ADP to form ATP. The other way is an anaerobic pathway, glycolysis. This is a pathway in which we're not using oxygen, and through the breaking down of sugar, we can recreate ATP. And then finally, we have aerobic respiration. Aerobic is when we're using oxygen, but we use oxygen to break down glucose to form ATP. And this is the most high-yielding source of ATP, is the aerobic respiration. So here's the creatine phosphate, and what has happened is we have a protein that has picked up a phosphate, and we'll link that with the ADP and an enzyme called creatine kinase, and the creatine kinase will transfer the phosphate group from the protein, and it'll transfer it to ADP, and in that process make ATP. And ATP is the high energy source. Ultimately, we'll go back the other way to do contraction as ATP, the high energy source, gets broken back down to ADP. That is what provides the energy for the muscle to contract and do its work. We also, then next, we have an anaerobic pathway. In this case, we don't have oxygen available. We're going through a process like glycolysis. We're taking glucose or glycogen, and glycogen is just a multi-unit form of glucose. And undergoing glycolysis, we produce 2 ATP by breaking down glucose in that manner, and we produce pyruvic and lactic acid. And notice we only produce a couple ATP. Finally, in the end, here is the aerobic pathway. In this case, we're using oxygen, and we're using oxygen to break down glucose or, again, break down glycogen. And with oxygen present, when we break down glucose or glycogen, we end up forming 32 ATPs. So this is through the aerobic pathway and aerobic respiration using oxygen that we can generate the most and the longest amounts of energy for the muscles to use to do their work. So when the muscles have these three ways of making ATP, so when and how do they use them? Let's take here, we're doing a short duration exercise. Someone is taking off their sprinting versus a prolonged duration exercise. They're running several miles. And when the muscles first start to work, they'll initially use the ATP stored in the muscle. They'll use the creatine phosphate pathway. And here, within the first 6 to 10 seconds, ATP is being formed from creatine phosphate. Now then, by 30 or 40 seconds into it, at that point, we've used all the ATP stored. We've used all the ATP that we can make from creatine phosphate. And now the muscles start to break down glycogen. And as they break down glycogen, they generate ATP. In this case, they're going through an aerobic pathway. They're not using oxygen to break down that glycogen. They're just using glycogen stored in the muscles, using an anaerobic respiration, generating ATP. But finally here, then, if we have a prolonged exercise in which we're running for a significant amount of time, or we're just on our feet all day, in that case, we'll create ATP using the aerobic pathway. And in the aerobic pathway, we are getting oxygen, and it's dependent upon oxygen being fed to those muscles, but the muscles then use the oxygen to make large levels of ATP to do prolonged exercise. And so that is how muscles create ATP, and then how they use ATP in exercise. Thank you.